people over 55. I find that incredibly interesting, a growth of over 640% in this particular segment. Why do you think that is? Or do you perceive it as more of a recreational use, or is it truly a sign of significant medical application? Before partial legalization, you had about 25% market share. The market has, of course, brutally grown or expanded since then. How does that look for you at the moment? What kind of changes have there been? Ultimately, I do believe that a good product will always manage to succeed, but the channels that you utilize, which channels in this segment are you finding most interesting right now, and which ones have worked out well for you in this highly regulated market? It's quite challenging.
It can never be just a single channel. It can never be just a single strategy. You can't always just do one single thing. Ultimately, it's a combination of everything, right? So you need awareness, you need all funnels working together, and then you also get the synergies and collateral effects, which in turn all positively impact each other. I believe that isolated strategies, when considered on their own, actually never truly make sense in online marketing. Toby, could you tell everyone a little about your background? CEO for CanDoc, and back then it was still a relatively new area as a telemedicine platform. Came from a fast-moving consumer goods e-commerce business, heavily driven by online marketing. Before I, let's say, then moved into the cannabis industry, I was already in the medical, or rather medical device sector, to implement solutions independently for wholesalers and also in the B2C area. I believe that was probably even the most important part of the whole story.
The Cannabis Conversation, powered by Lumino. Exploring the legal cannabis industry and the people shaping it. This episode explores building a cannabis brand in Europe, despite the lack of marketing rules and increasing demands. Tobias Bosse is Managing Director of CanDoc and CMO of Grünhorn, a leading medical cannabis group in Germany.
Great. Toby, I'm really pleased that you're able to join us. How are you?
Very good. Thanks a lot for the invite. Glad to be here, Nikita.
Oh yes, definitely, definitely. It's really nice to be back in Hamburg again. It's been a really long time since I was last here.
Well, you certainly picked good weather for that, didn't you?
It's actually much nicer than I had expected. It reminds me so much of Rotterdam, actually, from my time back in Holland, but it's even cooler.
Yes. So I feel incredibly comfortable here too. So it's wonderful that you're visiting.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, you're from Hamburg, aren't you?
I was born a native of Braunschweig, but I've been back here for 8 years now. I was here once before for my studies and then went back home again. And now I've been back here for 8 years and I'm very happy.
Fantastic. And the entire family is here as well.
Well, my immediate family and my social family is also here, but my actual family is still back in Braunschweig. You know,
Awesome.
My mother and my sister and so on.
And at Grünhorn, you have 2 offices, right? So you have one here and then in Leipzig.
Exactly. And in Leipzig is, so to speak, headquarters and also the associated mail order pharmacy, yes.
Excellent. Toby, for those who might not know you yet, could you tell us a bit about yourself? How exactly did you get into this industry? What's your professional background and how did you ultimately find your path into the industry?
Yes, quite interesting actually, and also fitting for the host about recruiting or recruiters. A headhunter, so to speak, approached me and pitched the position as CEO for CanDoc, and at that time it was still a relatively new field as a telemedicine platform. This was shortly after the partial legalization in 2024, and the concept of a telemedicine platform wasn't yet so, I'd say, well known. But essentially for me it was similar to just an e-commerce. Well, I came from the fast-moving consumer goods e-commerce business driven by online marketing, and from that I saw quite a lot of common ground with my experience and also with what my team had already been able to achieve. And I also found the new task simply from a cultural perspective. It was a completely new industry, which to be involved with, something that was already expected to grow very strongly at that time, to help shape how this industry is formed and to be a part of it. I found that to be incredibly exciting, and yes, I followed what you might call the headhunter's call and entered into discussions with the executives, and yes, fortunately I was able to assert myself and even convince a good portion of my team at the time to come along and yes, to build CanDoc together with me.
And what do you think about your prior experience that made it so interesting for Grünhorn to bring you in?
Yes, I think for one, as I said, this overall profile perhaps of a marketer who has already covered various areas in content marketing, but also handled things in the brand sector, e-commerce, and then also a certain degree of internationalization. I believe this isn't exactly, it is, after all, a German cannabis market, but it's certainly not a disadvantage if you also look a bit abroad to countries that have already had legalization, even if its nature is somewhat different, but simply not to lose sight, so to speak, at the German national border, but beyond that, to also have a bit of, yes, a good network perhaps even, and especially, of course, to be English speaking. I believe that was an interesting part of my profile. But on the other hand, I've also built companies myself, primarily in social media and online marketing. And this kind of entrepreneurship, I think, with a small team, high commitment, high inherent to bring motivation and to set ambitious goals for themselves, and then mostly, to implement them autonomously. I think that was probably even the most important part of the story.
Great. Okay. And naturally, in the cannabis industry, one always has to tread this very fine line, or rather this delicate path between ensuring full compliance and at the same time somehow managing to build a strong consumer brand. How do you personally navigate this particular path? What's your approach to thinking about it? I feel that with your rebrand, you've really hit the nail on the head, especially in how you've personally developed the brand. But could you elaborate on that? What was your underlying thought process?
Well, right. So before I, let's just say, moved into the cannabis industry, I was already working in the medical field, specifically in the medical device sector. I was trying to sell microneedling products in the skincare area, both to wholesalers and also directly to consumers. And even then, we already faced very significant restrictions regarding the HWG. And I think it's always important in this process to simply try to evoke certain emotions, and to emotionalize a brand or to emotionalize products or even to emotionalize results, and then somehow convey all of that in a way that isn't too pushy and isn't too salesy, but rather moves in the direction of something that truly begins with good branding, with emotional branding, and with to take the needs of consumers, or in this case, patients, seriously. Therefore, I believe it's first of all really important to know who exactly are your clients or your patients, to understand what their specific needs are and where do they spend their time. Where and how can I effectively reach them, with what kind of advertising messages or perhaps information and education? How can I reach them? How can I reach them emotionally and energize them for my brand? And that's how we then try to tackle the rebranding for Grünhorn, which you mentioned, with our agency KNSK, a Hamburg-based creative agency who gave us great support. And I believe that it has been very successful simply through the changes made to the logo to really break away from that very technical and rather cold medical clinical image, and instead adopt a rounder, more open and much more accessible design, as well as significantly warmer colors and noticeably warmer, warmer, but also more open typefaces. I'm not an illustrator, so please forgive me if I don't have the exact technical terms for it, but the overall concept was meant to represent that, and I think it really turned out very, very well in this case. So I'm definitely super happy with the rebranding and also with the relaunch.
Good too. Recorded?
Yes, that was actually right after. We naturally tried to promote the whole thing a bit internally to our colleagues first, and even there it quickly met with huge approval. And then relatively soon after the launch, many patients also proactively wrote to us and were, enthusiastic about it. These are mostly lay people, right? Pause, and they wouldn't immediately grasp the intention we had with it, of course. Pause. It's more subtle brand communication, but it seems to have really struck a nerve. Pause. And so far, I believe there hasn't been a single negative comment about the relaunch.
The channels you are publishing on. Which channels in this segment are currently interesting for you? Which ones have worked well for you? In this regulated market, it's relatively difficult. What has worked for you, and what do you need to see to say, okay, this is a good channel for us?
Yeah, I think the hardest part at the beginning was just finding advertising options, right? Because most big, especially social media platforms, where after all the majority of the reach simply lies, in most cases, simply due to policy reasons, they still quite closed off to performance ads in that area. And there are various ways to get certified for that. For example, LegitScript, which is a Canadian certification body or certifier for Meta, that you can then integrate into your code with a seal, and then you are allowed to run Meta ads. They then gradually opened it up. Honestly, today the situation is also different than it was a year and a half ago. It was significantly more challenging to gain visibility for, whether it's now telemedicine platforms or educational content in that field for greenhorns. And when we then noticed that we were frequently running up against a kind of policy wall, we then actually focused very heavily on organic reach and shifted a significant portion of our strategies towards the SEO domain. And with that, we also very quickly, so faster than expected, we were really able to capture a significant share of the market, so to speak, for us, because the impressions in this area for search queries for relevant keywords like cannabis patient, cannabis prescription, which all fall into the medical cannabis sector and ultimately relate to our service, we immediately secured a very good share, and then naturally we aim to continuously expand those strategies that had clearly proven quite effective right from the start. Eventually, competitors started to notice what we were doing, and then it naturally became more difficult because they simply ended up copying certain strategies. You see, that's just how it is in a market. It's simply part of the game, you know. But that also makes it exciting. You can't just lean back. You always have to put everything to the test, and if in doubt, maybe even throw everything out and start over. But that was actually, to this day, truly the best performing channel, because it has the highest search intent, because it has the best conversion rate, and because customers are simply already specifically looking for something that we offer. And in the paid media space, when you're talking about platforms like Meta, Reddit, also affiliate programs or native ads, you need to create a few more touch points until conversion, actually, which also work well now, you have to say, especially in retargeting. What's worth highlighting, for example, I would say, is Reddit, which are positioning themselves much better. Also those who have slowly opened up and have somewhat loosened their policies. And since that's been the case, I would say it's a very well-functioning channel, just as affiliate is a very well-functioning channel for us in our marketing mix. But it's never just one. It can never be just one channel. It can never be just one strategy. You can't always just do one thing. Ultimately, it's a combination of everything, isn't it? So you really need awareness. You need all funnels working together. Then you also get the synergies and collateral effects, which all positively impact each other. I believe isolated strategies alone never truly make sense in online marketing.
Absolutely, absolutely. You've brought up an interesting channel, which I think everyone is currently getting into, is affiliate marketing. But there are also various strategies. I think one I see a lot is this typical wrapper approach that people are taking. What do you think about that? And is that something you're trying to do?
First of all, no, let's not try to do that. I think that also it kind of waters down the effect, right? Because that was certainly at the beginning, and also especially with SSIO, for example, there was a huge hype, and rightly so, right? Well, I also think right now I really like SSIO as a musician, and also I find him super funny, just a cool character, such a great persona he's managed to create. And also, generally speaking, the entire launch phase of it was super clever, creative, right? If we weren't in the HWG area here, right? And I mean, that existed before too. In that area, Bloomwell has always done a lot, also with Zeta and others, let's say, rappers belonging to the label. It quickly isn't just a gray area, but already far beyond it. That's one danger. On the other hand, it's relatively clear that you won't get the best business deal for yourself there, let's say. And thirdly, from my perspective, it's not sustainable because you can generate short-term peaks, especially in the traffic area, but reach isn't the same as conversion. And you will simply, by having this huge commission or whatever it's called in this particular case, whether it's affiliate marketing or if it's a participation or perhaps even if they are shareholders in a brand, I don't know the specific contracts. There are several examples, including some recent ones, again, with Cedo and 187 and Massive at Grow. So there are really many examples which are all, great musicians, great products too, which is also a no-brainer essentially, right? Because the target audience probably really matches well together. But the way the market is, you really can't just ignore the market dynamics, and the market dynamics are simply quite different, You just simply have an incredibly vast product range. It's unbelievably wide. And beyond that, you also have very sharply falling prices. And that's actually a completely opposite direction, where products, promoted by musicians and rappers, because they're usually at the very top end of the price range, but the products themselves, in the rarest of cases, then also truly offer the quality, so to speak, that their price tag suggests, right? And then you're probably paying a lot for the name, right? And that's, from my perspective, a massive difference to, say, Khalifa. Those are incredibly good products, all hand-trimmed, Cookies, I think also with Burner, we were relatively early on that too. I don't know who started first, but it grew super organically, right? That wasn't like that. It was a super sustainable long-term strategy. You could see that immediately. It wasn't about just making a quick push and somehow delivering a good revenue quarter, but these are genuine brands. They've truly invested a lot into the brand story, and the artists genuinely stand behind the brand and not merely as a part of the brand. And as I said, what's more, they actually visit the facilities themselves. They possess an incredibly high level of expertise concerning the products, both of them, whether it's Burner or Wiz Khalifa. And that's this quality, which ultimately also determines the product's final price, is truly reflected. So with incredibly high tap-in levels calculated per gram as well, that's always really important, right? Unfortunately, far too few people actually pay attention to this. Most people only ever focus on the THC content and genetics. The terpene profile and how many terpenes per milligram in a flower are actually much more important.
Absolutely, yes. And are these products actually moving in the market? I mean, prices are high and they're currently falling everywhere. There are so many products available on the market. Are these products, which are backed by these rappers, actually still performing well in the market, or?
Yes, I do think it's lessened because, as I said, there are always more, right? So they just take away each other's market shares again, right? I believe, as I said, that the SIO launch at the beginning was very good because they really took a lot of time to prepare this launch well, right? And because I also simply believe it's important to SIO that he doesn't burn himself and his brand with it. But well, you hear a bit less now, I'd say, about this Tubiti Frubiti and that has, I think, already somewhat, because as I said, you have almost 2,000 products on the market, right? And who's supposed to keep track of all that? And it's more, I'd say the usage is leaning towards a kind of FOMO, You kind of have a fear of missing out, so you want to try out several things to see if they might be a better fit for you, because the selection is just so huge. And yeah, it's a bit of a curse and a blessing at the same time, of course, isn't it? So that's why I do believe that they generally do quite well, but whether it's a good deal for a pharmacist to basically fill their entire pharmacy with it, I'm not so sure. For the manufacturers and for the rappers themselves, I think it's still, to this day, a very good business. Otherwise, Sido and 187 wouldn't be trying again to position themselves in that particular market. But honestly, I don't really believe that looking forward, this will happen so frequently anymore. So either the brands will continue to be occupied by the existing rappers and brands, but I don't think that, I think the market is a bit saturated in that regard, I would say.
And what are then more interesting influences for you?
So influences in this area, I mean, I believe the entire influencer sector itself, that will certainly still change a bit, because simply this short-term approach, as we've come to know it, how influencer marketing ultimately grew, the market there is somewhat oversaturated. Users, especially social media users, are simply, I believe, also just a little bit fed up with being offered a new product with every single scroll and being aggressively advertised to, but rather, from my point of view, it's more about moving towards a more subtle form of product placement, once again, where you're attempting to achieve truly native integrations of products within very well-functioning, entertaining content to position them. I really believe it's becoming much more important again to simply create genuinely good content, So good relevant content and not content created solely for the purpose of self-promotion, or simply because of the product. That's simply too arbitrary then, and there again, there's too much content, too many creators, there's simply too much entertainment out there. That's also good, and because of that, something like this becomes too interchangeable, and I believe that this will move away from that a bit. We don't position ourselves, at least in the domain of very short-term influencer marketing activities, but if we do, it's more in the realm of UGC, meaning you'd probably have campaigns there, perhaps through user-generated content, so that you just, because ultimately creators are made to produce ads based on certain scripts, simply ads, which you can then also, where you can also put a media budget on to ultimately promote your service compliantly. Of course, you don't get the influencer's reach, but before I give an influencer 20K for a post, I'd rather put 20K into my own media. And then I also have control over the assets and especially data transparency. And in the best case, I can also adapt, right? That just makes things more difficult, especially with all these influencers. If you then want to run media on that content, you'll also need a buyout, which costs another 10 to 20K. and it's limited. So from my perspective, this is a business case that's becoming increasingly unattractive, given that more and more platforms are now opening up for cannabis companies to place any kind of advertising there. We actually tend to focus, as I just mentioned, on creating truly entertaining content. And for me, it's really more about controllability, scalability, and overall control. That's why we are more inclined, well, perhaps even to ensure that you truly own your media assets, that you simply own them, and that you then in turn create content, relevant content, and perhaps even market it, right? As a side project to then at any time run your own promotions there, and that with a very relevant reach as well, which fortunately...
Does anything change there? Perhaps a little, are there some channels that are better suited for your company's B2B side, or do you just use the same channels? It's still people at the end of the day, right?
Yes, well, at the end of the day, it's still a human being, but it's naturally measuring conversions in the B2B area is, of course, significantly more challenging, isn't it? I believe ultimately, especially in the cannabis industry, wholesaler business is almost entirely irrelevant for performance marketing. One really has to consider this now. The very nature of this industry appears to be that manufacturers, in quotation marks, are actually in the end also just wholesalers, but essentially wholesalers who possess a brand, and that brand very much requires B2C marketing, doesn't it? And to give a couple of examples here, for instance, Hawaii, they are very much involved in sports sponsorship, just like 420 and Canna Medical, who are quite active in sports sponsoring, but who also, I'd say, commit a lot in the medical sector, in the political sphere, and ultimately they try to do all of that, to represent in a brand, which is very challenging, but which they also manage to achieve well across various platforms, I believe. Well, but it's a bit hybrid, you see. On the one hand, it's geared towards pharmacies who ideally should stock the products. On the other hand, it also targets patients who ideally add these products to their cart, either directly from pharmacies or via telemedicine platforms. So that's something we don't really need that much right now, because we truly have a classic third-party wholesaler who doesn't require a strong B2C brand or positioning, but rather excels through a very traditional wholesale business in direct sales with pharmacies. And so that's why it's not yet such a huge topic in our marketing strategy, but rather CRM is a bigger topic for us than within our B2B sector. And we're currently trying to further optimize the B2B web shop, especially there. We're trying, especially in the interface logics with the pharmacy connections, but also again with telemedicine platforms to find links that in turn enable automated purchasing. So these are more the things that we're focusing on, really e-commerce optimization, less in the area of brand building or marketing, let's say in the classic sense.
You also just brought up sports marketing, and I find that incredibly interesting. Why do you believe that works so well? Or does it even work well, in your opinion?
Yes, I believe fundamentally sports sponsoring is always, to come back to the topic of stirring emotions, it is simply stirring emotions at the push of a button, if you will, So without you really having to do much for it, you simply have it through a club. Well, there are perhaps some that are better suited and some that are less so. So I believe for a strong emotional connection, for a really good emotional connection, you also need a very active fan scene. In the best case, you need perhaps a traditional club. He shouldn't be too unsuccessful. And I don't want to bash any clubs here, but for example, I'd say Hoffenheim or Wolfsburg might then be less interesting for at least not if you want to emotionalize your brand in a positive way. Then something like, for example, Union Berlin right now in the case of Hawaii, or certainly also Canna Medical or One FC Köln. These are definitely great examples. In addition, there's location marketing, an employer branding aspect that also comes into play, which is much more pronounced at 420 in Paderborn. I believe that's a very significant employer branding and also location marketing aspect within this sponsorship. And they also show a very strong commitment there as the jersey sponsor. But exactly, you get, first of all, frequent content because they play every week, You can actually always relate to recent results, to injuries, to title wins, to any positive things. You can actually always get relatively creative and draw something from that to
pick up on it for your social media channels or blog posts or whatever form it takes and reactivate your sponsorship with it, right? Beyond that, you also get the activations that the club provides, which means you then also gain a form of social proof, In other words, an established professional sports club promotes your brand and essentially creates a strong alliance. This is an ultimate social proof and a stamp for a compliant business, right? So, because, well, why would Union Berlin somehow do business with a fraudulent business or accept a sponsorship? Therefore, it's also a form of legitimacy. And for a Bundesliga club, yeah, that certainly carries significant weight, right? From my perspective, it's less about the reach you might get on, say, TV banners, but rather, if anything, in the area of, let's say, digital activations. In that regard, it can certainly be another good lever to generate greater brand awareness.
That's really cool. Yeah. No, that absolutely makes sense. It also feels like it's kind of moving into the mainstream then.
Exactly. It's being normalized, a little bit, made a bit more presentable by it. With that, these aforementioned manufacturers are ultimately doing the whole industry a favor, of course, right? So not just for themselves, but ultimately they ensure that, yes, the possibility and also the legalization itself of medicinal cannabis, yes, becomes more better known, moves more into the spotlight, and thereby also the impressions on Google increase, which of course I like in the end because we naturally get a fair share from that. Yes.
Really cool. Tobias, you mentioned positioning earlier, or I think before partial legalization, you had about 25% market share. I found that online. The market is, of course, brutally, or has it grown since then? What does that look like for you currently? What kind of changes are there? How do you see the world after the partial legalization right now?
So, as I already said, that has been, of course, absolutely disruptive in the most positive sense for the industry.
I mean, the import figures for the last year are truly, utterly, I don't have the exact figures right now, but the import numbers have, so to speak, multiplied many times over. But it's a massive increase. And so with that, naturally, especially for Grünhorn, which as a cannabis pharmacy still with a 25% market share before legalization, was one of the very few pharmacies in the market that even handled this very, very complex process of processing of narcotics. Back then, it was still a controlled substance medication one had taken at all. And back then, I wasn't part of Grünhorn myself yet, but from stories, I know that the police were literally on their doorstep once a month. And that, of course, changed with partial legalization. So the access to it became drastically easier. And from just a few cannabis pharmacies, we've now reached, I believe, almost 2,000. And this also serves as a significant incentive for pharmacists who these days can barely generate any profit from the limited products available, a good product to genuinely enhance their overall profit margins. So that's why many pharmacies are entering this sector, and that naturally led to us losing market share. But in an absolutely booming market, that's also something we can live with, because we have naturally also grown strongly despite everything. And I'd say we're now at maybe 15%. That's what I'd say roughly. We essentially cover the entire value chain within the industry. And as a group, I would say we are still the largest cannabis group in Germany. And as a pure pharmacy, as a pure cannabis pharmacy in the mail order sector, supposedly still the largest. But as I said, that is now distributed among significantly more shoulders. And from that perspective, I mean, naturally, we still have a very, very positive stance on this partial legalization, and are, of course, also super excited to see how the planned regulation will now proceed. However, we are also significantly, I'd say, more optimistic now than we were at the end of last year.
My clients also show that suddenly very optimistic.
Yes, that's also, it really does show, I mean, just how much fresh money is pouring into the industry, especially, from overseas as well. These are also very positive signs, let's say, coming from the M&A market. Furthermore, there's obviously a lot of disagreement, even within the CDU itself, regarding the planned amendment to the MedKenG. The SPD has long since stated that it will oppose this draft bill in its current form. Well, that would also likely be quite difficult to implement in that particular form. Therefore, we are optimistic that the industry will not experience such a significant, at least not a massive downturn
as was still feared last year. But it is still the case, and we at least assume that the market will consolidate more strongly throughout this year, and that the sheer number of these both telemedicine platforms and cannabis dispensaries will indeed be significantly reduced once again, because it's simply, as I said, the market price that is currently especially relevant for cannabis flowers is actually no longer a good business for almost anyone, for almost any market participant. And that naturally pushes many out of the market, right? Not many are able to participate in this price war, especially because, in my view, or perhaps based on our experience, the losses in profit margins were predominantly transferred to the pharmacies. And pharmacies, as well as telemedical platforms, naturally carry out a significant portion of the work involved in the processing, in the entire operational procedure, so to speak, of a cannabis therapy. And yes, that at some point it's simply no longer economically viable, no longer sustainable, or at least not lucrative to enter this market. And we've been observing for quite some time now that market entries are definitely declining significantly. And also, as mentioned, we're seeing consolidation, especially through M&A activity, steadily increasing more and more.
Yes, every single week there's new information. Yes. And how significantly has the price decreased? So how much has the margin shrunk?
Yeah, so after the partial legalization, it's naturally been quite substantial, right? Because it's also clear that the bureaucratic efforts and regulatory requirements have been massively restricted, and this then also allowed for more attractive pricing for buds. And then that remained relatively stable for a few months, and then things went, well, I would say, with especially in 2025 POS, where import volumes suddenly increased significantly POS and slipped into a kind of oversupply POS. There was then a massive drop off POS. According to our data, it should be somewhere between a quarter and a third. We are actually seeing a slight sideways movement again now. I mean, honestly, it could barely go any lower. It was truly at rock bottom, and now we've been seeing a sideways trend for roughly a month or two. And so we just hope now that the market recovers a bit and that we can return to a more stable and simply a good price for the product, because right now it's really more like it's being practically given away, you have to say. And because of that, unfortunately, some of the essential quality features of the product are lost. And so in the end, the one who, let's say, has the lowest price is the one who wins, and not the one who offers the best product. And from my perspective, especially in the context where we are discussing therapeutic measures, this is not the objective. It should not be the objective.
Yeah, no, I find it quite remarkable. Even when I'm traveling in Thailand with my clients there, and they're already a low-cost producer, they're trying to get their production costs per gram below 50 cents.
And most of them are even still hand trimmed.
It's completely hand trimmed.
In Thailand, a lot of it is still hand trimmed.
Cost-wise, it's still manageable, but I truly don't understand how the price can continue to drop even further, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, you're slowly getting into that fast fashion space too, right? So it's really always going further and further down. We know this from other industries. We know it's not healthy, but capitalism always does what it does, right? The market is always right, as they say. In that case, I think it really does make sense. I mean, for example, we ourselves, we're not completely against regulation either. I believe in many areas, regulation is even important for the market, because many things in the partial legalization, which were ultimately enshrined in the coalition agreement, could not yet be fully considered, how this market would develop and how it might also be partially undermined and infiltrated. And fundamentally, I do believe it makes sense to implement a regulation, but one that is also effective and doesn't make access to cannabis therapy and for existing patients practically impossible, that shouldn't be the goal here. It should be a proper improvement of the status quo and not a demonization or a real restriction based on stigmatization. And that is, at least in my opinion, more the goal of the draft bill rather than a truly good solution, especially for patients. That the patient simply stands more in the center of an upcoming regulation. And in doing so, of course, the positive economic factors for Germany as a country ultimately, as one must not neglect, right? We're already talking about billions in revenue right now after just 1.5 or even 2 years since legalization. Who knows where we could possibly be in 10 years' time? Thousands of jobs and significant economic power will emerge from this. We have very few industries in Germany that are still growing, and to then massively restrict one now, I'm not sure how smart that would be.
No, I completely agree with you on that. And since the partial legalization, there have naturally been some concerns regarding the regulations, which we've already touched upon. The how the fears have somewhat decreased, right? So don't worry so much anymore. What were the main points that most people were afraid of, and why is that no longer such a big concern for you?
Well, so for us as a mail order pharmacy, a shipping ban would have been an absolute overkill, of course. When we read that, our jaws just dropped because honestly, nobody saw something like that coming. I believe we weren't alone when this draft bill was dropped by Miss Walken.
Made little sense, I think.
Made little sense too. It also made little sense. Well, I mean, it depends if you, let's say, I don't want to accuse anyone here, but at least the pharmaceutical lobby and the alcohol lobby have done a pretty good job, I think, on this whole issue, because otherwise, from my perspective, it really makes no sense. Moreover, the entire draft bill, in my view, is rather destructive in its approach. It presents few solutions and many prohibitions. And well, that's why the shipping ban is certainly, that would have been the biggest problem from our perspective, but also the easiest to challenge. And beyond that, clearly the personal consultations for the initial prescription once a year was by itself a huge logistical challenge, especially for people in rural areas, or indeed those who have limited mobility, which is quite common, especially for individuals with chronic pain or in palliative care. It's certainly not uncommon for these people to have restricted movement, and particularly then in rural areas, they are dependent on getting delivery, or also, especially in the year 2026, simply be able to use telemedical digital communication methods. Even a phone, from my perspective, would have been enough. And then to restrict it in such a way, in my opinion, as I've already stated, is not objective. It is also not rational in this particular instance. It is purely attributable to the stigmatization of the product itself, and therefore those were already by far the two most significant, or would have been the two most impactful changes. And why that is now no longer...
Office hours aren't happening anymore either? Are they no longer?
At least not in person, So for that, definitely video, That's more what it seems like now, that it might perhaps rather settle on a video consultation for the initial discussion, so to speak.
Once a year.
Only once a year. Once a year, and then, as it were, follow-up prescriptions again, also on an online basis, based on a brief questionnaire. I mean, this should, in such a case, if a patient is well managed and there are no problems with their therapy, also be largely unproblematic. I believe that this would then truly allow for effective regulation. Additionally, I would also like to see some form of perhaps even certification for telemedicine platforms, as it will prove challenging to enforce these new regulations, especially for companies whose platform operators are located abroad, specifically in other European countries. We observe time and again that, let's say some complaints are in part unresolvable, and that certain regulatory changes are simply not put into effect or not adhered to, while others do adhere to applicable law. And this, of course, then naturally leads to unequal treatment. So from my perspective, it would perhaps be a good approach to say, you come as a German authority and try to carry out a certification for telemedicine platforms, in which you work with German doctors, their accreditations, and also with pharmacy licenses with whom you collaborate, simply to show that you have compliant processes. And then you receive this official seal, and then pharmacies are permitted to dispense the prescription that has come from this teleclinic. And then, for example, payment solutions would also be able to work with this teleclinic, because I believe these are the only two levers a German authority has. If a platform operator is based abroad within Europe, then you can ultimately only address them via payment solutions and the withdrawal of the BaFin license for those payment solutions, or through pharmacies who then simply must not fill prescriptions from platform operators who do not comply with this law or who might not be certified.
And if this consultation actually comes to pass, so that everyone has to speak with a doctor once a year, even if it's done online, it would still be logistically quite challenging. Why? And I can imagine that would be very challenging. Is that the case? Or
Well, yes, of course, it's initially a bottleneck, isn't it? So you naturally have, it's simply due to the time slots that are then limited for a video call and a consultation. You naturally face a restriction, especially, so to speak, if the law were to become strict, then you immediately have a huge demand for patients who need to do a video call. And then, of course, the challenge for these platform operators is to create as many available slots for doctor consultations as quickly as possible. In a video call, that will certainly be quite a significant challenge. I believe that market shares will also be reallocated once again, because this is a multi-stage product that you then have to market. And on the one hand, availability, that will naturally be the most crucial aspect, you know. If there are no available times, no slots available, then ultimately you won't be able to market anything at all. Then the price is going to be a really big factor, right? So at what level will this video consultation be priced? Thirdly, what's the nature, tell me, of this video call, right? Are we talking now, because I believe that this will be the greatest challenge for most cannabis patients, that they now have to sit down with a doctor and explain why they still want to be or need to be a cannabis patient, why it helps them. And I believe that then that could prove to be a significant obstacle when compared to many patients who, up until now, have only completed their medical history or anamnesis through an online questionnaire. That means the wording, how this product, the video consultation, is ultimately described, that should also play a considerable role.
So it's quite conceivable that some people who received their prescription based on the results of the questionnaire might now, after they've had a conversation with their doctor, not be able to obtain it anymore.
Yeah, sure. Theoretically, that's how it is, right? So you can't just sit down now and somehow say, give me weed, right? I mean, you're not at the dealers, right? Well, you're at the doctor's, and the indication really has to fit the product, and there must be no contraindications present, and certain other things which you also have to answer truthfully in the questionnaire. Those two must, of course, be answered correctly and truthfully during a conversation, and possibly further follow-up questions might even arise beyond that, and that's probably exactly a fear that many of the existing patients might share, especially as they'll then become new patients. That will likely be quite deterring initially. I believe that this will definitely initially halt the growth, which has actually been continuous for almost 2 years now, right? So that's to be expected.
And in the market, you don't see much loyalty. In North America, you don't necessarily see a lot of loyalty to brands or specific brands. You also just mentioned that market share can be redistributed if such rules are introduced. I mean, you also have several companies that have a few 100,000 patients, and then suddenly from one day to the next, they all have to speak with a doctor. And if I'm a patient right now, and I'm with you, for example, it takes 2 whole weeks for me to speak with a doctor there. But at Blumel, I can do it in 2 days, and suddenly I'm a Blumel patient, right? So you can imagine that's exactly how it would happen, right?
Yes, exactly. That's what I mean, that first and foremost, availability is the most restrictive and limiting factor, right? So, for example, with us, we currently have almost 140,000 patients. If I can offer all of them an appointment slot within 2 weeks, then I should be able to retain a relatively good share of them and convince them, so to speak, to stay with us. If that doesn't succeed, then they will look for alternatives, because exactly as you say, brand loyalty in this particular area practically doesn't exist anymore, at least not since the legalization. It existed before because, as I said, there were, let's say, good products, meaning significantly fewer products at first, and then some that were perfectly suited for certain indications. Today, as I said, it's also, I think, an open secret that the medical market is heavily infiltrated by recreational usage. Yes, the image of the patient has simply changed, and with it, ultimately, the demand for products. And as you mentioned, brand loyalty doesn't really exist, neither for teleclinics nor for pharmacies, nor for pharmacies, perhaps it's most likely, right? Because you have a certain service expectation, and if that is consistently maintained at a high level, then I believe you have a very good chance that retention will be very high. But apart from that, when it comes to specific strains or even particular manufacturer brands, I think for the vast majority of the market, there's very little brand loyalty. And in that regard, it's probably exactly as you've mentioned, the sheer availability and ultimately the final price. Are these precisely the deciding factors, and not, oh, darn it, I'll just stick with the platform after all and wait for 2 months, or pay an additional 50 euros or drive an extra 60 kilometers to a doctor I absolutely must see? That won't be difficult. I mean, no, it's rather cozy, comfortable, because the availability of providers is so numerous. You simply have enough alternatives to switch to, right? Yeah. And what's more, and this is a very, very important factor, Once the initial consultation has taken place and the first prescription has been issued, then the retention rate should be very, very high. Because then the loyalty should also be very high, at least for a year, Because if you've had this video consultation, then you essentially have the right to receive follow-up prescriptions for the next 12 months based on an online questionnaire. And this process will probably be utilized by quite a lot of people. So we can safely assume that retention after such a regulation should be at 90% or even higher. Very nice, very nice. No, because also in Canada, when Reg. 2 was introduced, everything was sold. So all the producers said, okay, we are doubling our production for the next quarter.
But then there was no brand loyalty, and it was really just the market saying, all right, let's just try everything out. And then in the end, they didn't buy the same products twice. Do you see something similar now with this V crisis growth that we've seen over the last year?
Can you tell if the same products are always being sold again? Do you understand the question? Yes, I understand. Well, yes and no, I'd say. So, you have certain products that always do well. They just always sell because they're simply good, In the end, I believe a good product will always succeed, okay?
But there's always, it really helps if you've been around for a longer time, For example, Aurora is a super well-established brand, high quality, everyone knows that. Bedanios, another great brand, offers fantastic products as part of its range. That's a sure shot. You won't make a mistake. The pricing behind it is also quite decent, right? But in that case, they really don't have to worry. I believe that they won't be able to sell their products, right? However, if you, let's say, come along as a completely new brand and you have a comparable profile, then it will initially be much harder to establish yourself there because there are simply just so many alternative and competing products available. It makes more sense then, I think, to focus on occupying market segments that aren't yet so strongly saturated, right?
So that could be, for example, products that are well balanced. Where you genuinely have a truly equal amount of CBD and THC.
Or rather more in the low THC range where you have low THC but high terpenes. There isn't much available there yet. And I, for example, make sure that on our telemedicine platform and also in the pharmacy, we maintain a very balanced portfolio covering both low and high THC, as well as the budget to premium segment. And I believe that if you truly want to position yourself there with new products, then it really makes sense to take a look at where there are already high rollers, where there are fast-moving items that are performing very well and where there might still be a gap that you could fill. And then I think you also have a good chance. I also read that allegedly the fastest growing patient segment consists of people over 55.
I find that really interesting. So over 40% growth in this segment. Why is that, do you think? Or do you see, is this more recreational use or is this truly a sign of strong medical use? I believe it's, on the one hand, primarily about education more, right? So the availability and the public awareness that stands behind it. I don't think it's largely recreational, no.
But you also have many, especially, let's say, in the 60, 70 years and older age group, you've still got some of those old 68ers, right? A generation that already possesses a fundamental openness, I'd say, towards the cannabis plant itself. And these are also relative figures, relative growth. That's the largest, isn't it? In absolute terms, it's naturally not the fastest growing group when it comes to the actual numbers. But relatively speaking, it is completely correct that it's several 100% growth. And that's also because access through telemedicine platforms has now become significantly easier, right? We also conducted many patient interviews, and the main problem was that no doctor ever wanted to prescribe cannabis. The point wasn't even for this to be covered by statutory health insurance or to be reimbursed by a public health fund. It was purely about establishing an alternative to pain medications, especially opiates, which they had earnestly desired because they were experiencing numerous genuinely adverse effects from their opiate consumption and desperately wished to discontinue it. Still, no one prescribed it, and now we also have these telemedicine platforms which provide easier access, particularly for those of advanced age, completely undermining the politicians' claims that they are merely, ultimately just pusher platforms. And it's truly accessible even for those individuals who were previously denied access to cannabis therapies simply because of, a restrictive stance from their doctors. And accordingly, because the number was extremely low before, this represents the relatively largest increase we've observed. And I think that's a very good sign because we're also getting very, very positive feedback from the older patients we've spoken with regarding cannabis therapy. And I believe that many more people should try it. I also, for example, introduced it to my mother, and said, try it out, and replace your Ibu 600s that you take for knee or hip problems, at least for sleeping, so you can finally sleep through. And she also reported really great experiences with it, especially that the side effects on the internal organs simply vanish,
Yeah, no, we've definitely seen that ourselves. So we've actually been doing this since 2018, and we've placed some of the very first doctors in Germany and also some of the first doctors in England. And it was genuinely difficult to find physicians who were truly willing to engage with this subject matter. And millions were invested into the marketing or the extensive training for these doctors who, quite frankly, didn't even want to be trained. And it only changed once their waiting room was full of 10, 20 cannabis patients all saying, hey, we're here for cannabis. And suddenly they wake up and then all of a sudden they're prescribing cannabis, So it's really commercially driven. Yeah. Not just stigma. We also thought, okay, perhaps young doctors are more inclined, are more open to prescribing cannabis. It turns out that when you've just spent 7 years at university and are just graduating, you don't want to be immediately labeled as a cannabis doctor, right? So actually, it was only the older doctors who had seen how new medicines or new molecules established themselves in medicine who were actually open to continuing their education.
But ultimately, it's still a question of stigmatization. If you say 7 years after finishing your studies, you don't want to be branded as a doctor who prescribes cannabis. Exactly. No, that's still very much dependent on the stigma, because in the end, you wouldn't be labeled an oxy doctor just because you happen to prescribe oxys, right? And that is in turn a clear case of unequal treatment when compared to other prescription medications, which is truly a shame, isn't it? Yes, that it's so ingrained in the minds, even of physicians who should actually know better, that we have a cannabinoid system, that it's simply natural, right? And that they don't prescribe anything that's, that is in any way more harmful than the chemically based pain medications they usually throw around, right? Yes, so...
No, absolutely, absolutely. Good. Toby, I believe we've certainly reached our time. It was an incredibly great pleasure. So thank you very, very much for your time.
If there's one thing, if you could give people one piece of advice to take with them, what would that be? Oh yes, I think it's simply openness. Stay open-minded about the topic. Even if you might feel there's a bias or certain prejudices, try to gather your own information and speak with people who truly know something about the core of the product.
And yes, to everyone in the industry, I'm crossing my fingers that we all get a regulated law in the future that still allows this industry to breathe and also gives enough room for compliant competition. Absolutely. Great, Toby. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, you're welcome. I was very pleased. I also had a lot of fun. Awesome.
The Cannabis Conversation, proudly presented by Lumino. As always, thank you for joining us, and please subscribe or follow this podcast to be the first to hear all future episodes.